The Marguerite Oswald imposter was interviewed at the youth house by probation officer John Carl. She said that she was the youngest of 6 children, yet there were 5 children in the Claverie family. She gave Lee Oswald's father's name as Robert Lee Harvey, when his real name was Robert Edward Lee Oswald. She said Lee's father died at age 45, yet we know he was 43 when he died. She gave her marriage date as July 19, 1929. Yet she married Robert Oswald in 1933. She said she formerly owned a house in Corning, Texas. Yet there is not and has never been a Corning, Texas. She gave Lee Harvey Oswald's birth date as October 19th, when the correct date was October 18th. When this imposter was asked whether Lee's father was right or left-handed, she replied, "I do not remember, sir."
The Two Marguerite Oswald. What was the first item that came to your attention that you thought this is something worth investigating here?
2 boys. They're 12 years old. They can't live by themselves. They have to have people taking care of them. Lee Oswald's mother, obviously, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, is the mother of Lee Oswald. You've got this short, thin, Russian-speaking boy. Who's his mother? Caretaker, whatever. So they have to have caretakers when they're 12 years old. That's what got me interested in looking into the background of Marguerite Oswald. Nice-looking Marguerite Oswald, who was constantly employed, constantly selling women's dresses and clothing, and Avon representative and so on, working for large department stores. And then you see the historical Marguerite Oswald, heavy set. She always wears glasses. Her physical features are very, very different. And when you read certain testimony of people who knew her in the 1930s and 1940s and simply could not believe it was the same woman on TV in 1963 that they had known just 9 years earlier, the problem is that when you're doing research in this particular area, you're actually dealing with not 2 people, but 3 so-called people. And what I mean by that is, you've got, for example, Lee Harvey Oswald. Then you've got a Russian-speaking Lee Harvey Oswald who substituted because he spoke Russian and went to Russia and so on. But then you've got the third part, and that's the Warren Commission's Lee Harvey Oswald, where they take information from the real Lee Harvey Oswald and from Harvey Oswald and piece it together to make a third invented person, if you will, that's a combination of both real people. So this is not easy. It's not easy for me sometimes, but it's not easy to follow. It's taken me years and years to come to the point where I am. And when you look at Marguerite Oswald and the woman who impersonated her, it's the same thing. Many of our researchers know that Marguerite Oswald, that we know, the historical Marguerite Oswald, worked for King Candy Company, had a jar fall on her head, and then she was unemployed, and she went to this doctor and that doctor and tried to get workers' comp and so on. Well, when you piece all these things together, when you put everything in order, what you find is the accident happened on December 5th, 1958. She's unemployed all the way through the entire year of 1959 and part of 1960. Remember, she was trying to get her son, the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, out of the Marines early to come back and take care of her. That was the whole purpose of the jar falling on her head. Now, here you've got John Pick talking about taking his family and driving from the East Coast to San Francisco to catch a boat to go over to Japan. And Pick says, we stopped at Mother's house Halloween night, and that I visited her the next day. She was selling clothes at Cox's department store. Well, that's just a statement, and most people just look at it and say, okay. Well, to me, that's very, very significant. Cox's department store selling dresses is not working at King Candy Company in the Fair Ridgely store, 2 separate department stores. So now we have John Pick telling the Warren Commission that he personally visited his mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, selling dresses at Cox's department store the day after Halloween, 1958. Then you got Robert Oswald's testimony, and they asked Robert Oswald when the last time he saw his mother. And Robert Oswald said It was the second Saturday in April 1959. Where was she working? She was working at Cox's department store. Well, you put those two things together, and you've got the mother of Robert and John Pick working at Cox's department store from the fall of 1958 through the late spring summer of 1959. Wait a minute. I thought Marguerite Oswald got a jar knocked on her head and she was unemployed for the entire year of 1959. When you put those two things side by side, something's wrong. You've got John Pick's and Robert Oswald's mother working at Cox's department store for 8 months, while the other Marguerite Oswald, the one that we know as the historical Marguerite Oswald, was unemployed. The two different women, two different places, same time. For hundreds of years, secret agents and spies have been used to confuse, mislead, deceive, in order to acquire sensitive military information. Spies often assume the identity of a person who died as a child, died in battle, or simply disappeared. However, there are many problems when a spy assumes the identity of a dead person. The main problem has always been the inability to trace the biography of a spy back to their families, to their childhood, and to their birth. A basic requirement for infiltrating a spy into a foreign country is that he or she speak and read the local language fluently. After all, it would be pointless to send an English-speaking spy into China, Russia, the Middle East, unless they spoke and read the language. Tens of millions of people were killed in Europe during World War II, which resulted in tens of thousands of refugee children from many different countries. Thousands of these underage children, who spoke only their native languages, were relocated to the United States and placed with foster families. One of these children, in my opinion, was a 6, 7, or 8-year-old Russian-speaking boy who was placed with a middle-aged woman caretaker in New Jersey and or New York. In the early 1940s, Marguerite Claverate Oswald, the mother of John Pick, Robert Oswald, and Lee Oswald, was working for the U.S. Navy in Algiers, Louisiana, across the river from New Orleans. One of her sons, Lee Harvey Oswald, was only 2 years old, born in New Orleans on October 18, 1939. Marguerite soon met Edwin Ekdahl, an electrical engineer who worked for Ebasco Services Company in New York City. One of Ebasco's projects was the design of a large electrical generation station in the Soviet Union, which suggests this company worked closely with U.S. intelligence. In 1964, following the assassination of President Kennedy, the FBI requested information from Ebasco related to the employment of Mr. Ekdahl. The FBI was told that Ebasco was unable to provide such information. In 1945, Marguerite Claverate Oswald moved to Fort Worth and married Ekdahl. 2 years later, in the summer of 1947, while living with Ekdahl and her 3 sons at 1505 8th Avenue in Fort Worth, another Marguerite Oswald was living at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas, with a young Russian-speaking boy who was given the name Harvey Oswald. What follows is a detailed biographical study of a government-sponsored caretaker who I call the Marguerite Oswald imposter, who was given the job of taking care of young Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald. For the next 12 years, this imposter and Harvey lived in close proximity to Marguerite Claverate Oswald and her son, Lee Harvey Oswald. As these young boys lived nearby in the same cities, often attended the same schools, and later spent time in the Marine Corps, both Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald had established very similar backgrounds. At age 18, the plan was to have Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald assume the identity of American-born Lee Harvey Oswald. Harvey would then defect to the Soviet Union, where his native Russian-speaking ability would be invaluable. The Russian KGB, if concerned or curious about this American defector, would then be able to track back Lee Harvey Oswald's background to his birth. The mother of Lee Harvey Oswald and the caretaker imposter mother of Harvey Oswald were part of what CIA accountant James Wilcott called the Oswald Project, a highly secret American intelligence operation crypto-named RX-ZIM. The intent of the Oswald Project was to send a young man who secretly understood the Russian language to the Soviet Union with a U.S. identity. The American public was never supposed to know anything about Harvey Oswald or the Marguerite Oswald imposter. The following sheds light on both the two Lee Harvey Oswalds as well as the two women who served as their mothers. On May 7, 1945, Marguerite Claverley Oswald and Ekdahl were married in Rockwall, Texas. Marguerite Claverley Oswald was a steadying influence on her son Lee Oswald, who always had a history of good attendance at schools in Fort Worth and New Orleans. The Oswalds, Pick, Robert, Lee, spent the entire Christmas holidays of 1947 at 1505 8th Avenue with Ekdahl. Now, 1947 was a very important year for the Oswald family. On July 7th, 1947, Marguerite Claverley Ekdahl purchased a small home at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas, a suburb of Fort Worth. In the spring of 1948, Marguerite Claverley Oswald left Edwin Ekdahl, filed for divorce, and moved to a small home at 3300 Willing in Fort Worth. Researchers should note that the FBI did a very good job in piecing together Marguerite Claverley Oswald's work history in the 1940s through the 1950s. We know the dates, we know the people she worked for, we know the time she worked. In January 1953, the House Un-American Activities Committee file in New York City made a reference to a Mrs. M. Oswald in a CIA Office of Security file. This file contained references to 1941, Nazis, and New Jersey. Judge John Tunheim of the Assassination Records Review Board wrote to Henry Hyde and requested the HUAC file on Mrs. M. Oswald, but his request was denied. In February, John Pick and his family were invited to dinner at the Oswald's apartment. This was the last time John Pick would see his brother for 9 years. The next time John Pick saw Lee Harvey Oswald was in 1962, when Pick was invited to Thanksgiving dinner at Robert Oswald's home. And this is where he met the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald. Pick testified and told the Warren Commission, quote, "The Lee Harvey Oswald I met in November 1962, Thanksgiving, was not the Lee Harvey Oswald I had known 10 years previous in New York. Robert Oswald most certainly knew that the Russian-speaking Harvey at Thanksgiving in his home in 1962 was not his brother. This is because Robert Oswald had lived with both Harvey and the Marguerite Oswald imposter at 4936 Collinwood for 6 months in 1956. In January 1954, Marguerite Claverley Oswald and Lee Oswald relocated from New York to New Orleans. Marguerite rented an apartment at 1454 St. Mary's from her longtime close friend, Myrtle Evans, and began work at Burt's Shoe Store. Myrtle Evans and Marguerite had known each other for 20 years. Myrtle saw and talked with Marguerite and Lee Oswald nearly every day when they lived in her apartment building in 1954. Myrtle said, quote, "Marguerite was a very good housekeeper, very tasty. She was always so lovely herself. She was beautiful." Myrtle's husband, Julian Evans, said of Marguerite, "She was a fashion plate." According to neighbor Mildred Sawyer, Marguerite was working at Krieger's department store and later at Gold Rings. Now, let me just say that Gold Rings is very important because, as we will see, Marguerite Oswald worked on and off at Gold Rings 1954, 1957, 1958, 1960. She had continued employment for Gold Rings. But the FBI never interviewed anyone at Gold Rings and never obtained any employment information relating to Marguerite Claverie Oswald from gold rings. On July 31st, 1956, Marguerite Claverie Oswald terminated her employment at Gold Rings. John Pick told the Warren Commission that Robert Oswald drove to New Orleans, picked up his mother and brother, and drove them to Fort Worth. Marguerite rented an apartment at 3830 West 6th in September 1956. Robert Oswald was then living a few miles away at 4936 Collinwood with the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald. The FBI now had information that Marguerite Claverie Oswald was working at Gold Rings and Krieger's department stores in the early 1960s. To confirm her dates of employment, the FBI only needed to secure employment records from Gold Rings and Krieger's, interview management and coworkers. The FBI could also obtain canceled payroll checks from Gold Rings and Krieger's, as well as state income tax records from the state of Louisiana. But if the FBI had conducted an honest investigation concerning Marguerite Claverie Oswald's employment in Fort Worth and New Orleans from 1956 to 1963, those records would have conflicted with the Marguerite Oswald imposter's various residences and employment in New Orleans and Texas at the same time. Local FBI agents thoroughly investigated Marguerite Claverie Oswald's employment from the 1940s to the mid-1950s. They interviewed employers, coworkers, and beginning and ending dates of her employment. But in 1956, their investigation of Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her employment ended because their investigation was now focused on the Marguerite Oswald imposter. While Marguerite Claverie Oswald was living in New Orleans, the summer of 1959, the Marguerite Oswald imposter was unemployed and living in Fort Worth. In fact, when researchers look closely into the work history of the Marguerite Oswald imposter, they find that during most of her life, she was unemployed. She was unemployed in 1947 while living in Benbrook and did not have a car. There's no record of her employment in New York in 1952 and 1953. And there's only one record of her employment in New Orleans from 1954 through 1956, and that was when she worked a few months at Dolly Shoe. And then she was fired from Dolly Shoe because she wouldn't fill out detailed personal information for the insurance company. In 1959, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald was in the Marine Corps in Santa Ana, where he constantly spoke Russian and talked about Cuba, Castro, and communism in preparation for his upcoming defection to the Soviet Union. In September, Harvey Oswald was discharged from the Marines, secured passage on a boat to Europe, and obtained a visa to enter the Soviet Union. A month later, after his defection became public, the press focused their attention on his mother, the Marguerite Oswald imposter, who was living in Fort Worth, while the real Marguerite Oswald, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, was living in New Orleans. Now, Lee Oswald, unlike his mother, who was quietly living in New Orleans, remained visible after Harvey Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union. Lee Oswald used his real name and participated in Cold War shenanigans in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and New York. These activities in 1960 and 61 raised an alarm bell at the FBI and caused J. Edgar Hoover to believe that an imposter was using Oswald's identity because Harvey Oswald was in Russia. Marguerite Oswald, who testified before the Warren Commission, claiming to be the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. She was, however, an imposter. This woman was not the mother of Harvey Oswald. In fact, was physically in stark contrast to the much taller, attractive, pleasant, well-dressed mother of Lee Oswald. In the latter half of the 1940s, this woman became the caretaker of a young Russian-speaking boy who was relocated to the United States by an agency of United States intelligence. The young boy was given the name Lee Harvey Oswald, while this unidentified and unknown woman, the caretaker, was given the name Marguerite Oswald. Their assignment was to mirror the lives of Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son, Lee Oswald, for the next 10 years. They accomplished this by living in close proximity, which provided Harvey and Lee an opportunity to attend the same schools. The goal was for both boys to live and experience very similar backgrounds. As young adults, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald would then switch identities with Lee Oswald for the purpose of defecting to the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald could gather information and act as a spy on behalf of our Central Intelligence Agency. These two Oswald families were the central figures in the Oswald Project, a plan created by U.S. intelligence to place a young Russian-speaking American person inside the Soviet Union. The Marguerite Oswald imposter was short, around 5 feet tall, heavy-set, poorly dressed, and appeared to be many years older than Marguerite Claverie Oswald. She first appeared with Harvey Oswald in Benbrook, Texas, a suburb of Fort Worth, in June 1947. They moved into a small house at 101 San Saba that was recently purchased by the real Marguerite Claverie Oswald, who was then living with her husband, Edwin Ekdahl, at 1505 8th Avenue, 7 miles away. Now, let's be clear. The Marguerite Oswald imposter was the caretaker of Harvey Oswald from 1947 through his enlistment in the Marine Corps in 1956. The Marguerite Oswald imposter was interviewed at the youth house by probation officer John Carl. During this one interview, this Marguerite Oswald imposter made countless mistakes about her family background, mistakes that the real Marguerite Oswald would never make. Following are a few biographical mistakes made by the Marguerite Oswald imposter during this one interview. The Marguerite Oswald imposter told John Caro that she was the youngest of 6 children, yet there were 5 children in the Claverie family. She gave Lee Oswald's father's name as Robert Lee Harvey, when his real name was Robert Edward Lee Oswald. She said Lee's father died at age 45, yet we know he was 43 when he died. This imposter gave her marriage date as July 19, 1929, yet she married Robert Oswald in 1933. She gave her sister's name as Lillian Segore, when we know her sister's name was Lillian Moret. She said she formerly owned a house in Corning, Texas, yet there is not and has never been a Corning, Texas. She gave Lee Harvey Oswald birth date as October 19th, when the correct date was October 18th. She said Lee was baptized at the Trinity Lutheran Church in New Orleans, when records show he was baptized at the Redeemer Lutheran Church. When this imposter was asked whether Lee's father was right or left-handed, she replied, "I do not remember, sir." Marguerite Claverie Oswald, the mother of Lee Oswald, would never have made these mistakes concerning her background. In the summer of 1953, a few months after Harvey Oswald was released from youth house, the unemployed Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey left New York City and resided briefly in Stanley, North Dakota. Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son Lee were still living in New York City. It was in North Dakota that Harvey became friends with William Henry Timmer and talked about his involvement with teenage gangs in New York City. Teenage gangs, New York City, 1953. This was when Harvey was truanting from school. In the fall of 1953, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey left North Dakota and moved to New Orleans, while the Marguerite Oswald imposter worked briefly as a barmaid, where little personal information or payroll tax information was required. In the fall of 1954, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey left New Orleans and moved into an apartment in Fort Worth. It is worth remembering that the Marguerite Oswald imposter had furniture and clothing stored at the same address in 1947 when she was living in Benbrook. Here she is again in 1954, living at 2220 Thomas Place. And then, believe it or not, on November 22nd, 1963, she was again living at 2220 Thomas Place. In January 1955, Harvey Oswald and Marguerite Oswald imposter left Fort Worth and returned to New Orleans, where both began working full-time for Maury Goodman at the Dolly Shoe Store on Canal Street. Mrs. Oswald was asked to fill out detailed personal information required by the store's insurance company. She ignored the request. A few months later, when asked to fill out detailed personal information, the Margaret Oswald imposter once again refused and was fired. Newly hired store manager Louis Marzali recalled that after Mrs. Oswald's employment was terminated at Dolly Shoe, he saw her working as a barmaid at the Tradewinds Bar on Decatur Street in New Orleans. There's no evidence that the Margaret Oswald imposter ever owned a car until 1961. Marguerite Claverie Oswald, on the other hand, was known to drive a car and own a car in the early 1940s, late 1940s, all the way up through the 1950s. Harvey Oswald and the Margaret Oswald imposter left New Orleans and moved to Fort Worth. 22-year-old Robert Oswald moved in with Harvey Oswald and the Margaret Oswald imposter. Robert opened a bank account at the West Side State Bank. Robert was then dating Veda Mercer, who he would marry 5 months later in November. But Robert never introduced Veda to the Margaret Oswald imposter, nor to Harvey Oswald. This makes sense, because Harvey Oswald was not Robert's brother, and the Margaret Oswald imposter was not his mother. On July 31st, 1956, Marguerite Claverie Oswald quit her job at Goldring's department store in New Orleans. Now remember, the Margaret Oswald imposter was already living at 4936 Collinwood. Robert Oswald married Veda Mercer, and the Margaret Oswald imposter was now living alone in the apartment. Veda told the FBI, quote, she never met Lee Harvey Oswald prior to their marriage. And just as interesting was that neither Harvey Oswald nor the Margaret Oswald imposter attended Robert Oswald's wedding in November. Now this makes perfect sense, now that we know Margaret Oswald imposter was not Robert's mother and Harvey was not Robert's brother. On May 17, 1958, a $1,000 life insurance policy on Lee Harvey Oswald lapsed due to non-payment of the premium. Lee Oswald applied to the company for reinstatement of the policy. Now, the application was witnessed by fellow Marine Peter Cassisi, who later told the FBI, quote, he did not recognize Lee Oswald as a former Marine associate when he saw pictures of Harvey Oswald that were published in the media after the assassination. Two different people. While working at King Candy, the Margaret Oswald imposter claimed that a jar fell on her head, causing injury. She visited several physicians in December, and on January 30th, 1959, told Dr. Milton Goldberg that her son, the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, wanted to defect to Russia. In February, she visited 2 more doctors, and the following months, she received treatments. March 16th, 18th, 20th, 23rd, 25th, 27th, and 30th. In April, she received treatments the 2nd, the 4th, the 6th, the 11th, and was referred to Dr. McKinney and Dr. J.C. Baxter. On April 20th, the Margaret Oswald imposter filed a notice of claim for compensation with the Industrial Board of Texas. On May 9th, she had x-rays taken at the Fort Worth Osteopathic Hospital. May 19th, Liberty Insurance suspended compensation payments. On October 4th, the Texas Industrial Accident Board ordered Liberty Insurance to pay her $29 per week for 12 weeks. Now, following her so-called injury on December 5th, 1958, the Margaret Oswald imposter was unemployed for the entire year of 1959. While the Margaret Oswald imposter was unemployed and busy visiting doctors, Robert Oswald told the Warren Commission that he visited his mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, at Cox's department store on a Saturday in April 1959. Robert Oswald and John Pick placed their mother at Cox's department store in the fall of 1958, and both men saw her working when they visited Cox's department store in the spring of 1959. Clearly, the tall, nice-looking, well-dressed Margaret Oswald once again selling women's dresses, while the Margaret Oswald imposter is unemployed and was unemployed for the entire year of 1959. the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey were shadow-like personas of Marguerite Clary Oswald and Lee Oswald. These two families lived in the same cities and often at slightly different times at the same addresses. Harvey and Lee often attended the same schools, were both in the Marine Corps, both attended radar school at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, and on occasion had the same friends, again at slightly different times. For example, it was Lee Oswald who knew David Ferry in the CAP in 1955, but it was Harvey Oswald who knew David Ferry in 1963. This was the CIA's Oswald Project, and the intent was to merge the identity of a Russian-speaking youth, Harvey, with the background of an American citizen, Lee Oswald. Once complete, the Russian-speaking youth, Harvey, could be verified as born in the U.S., raised in the U.S., and a former Marine. Lee Harvey Oswald was now ready to defect to the Soviet Union, where his proficiency in the Russian language would be invaluable. The Marguerite Oswald imposter moved continuously, had no close friends, purchased her first car in 1961, and was never able to hold a job for more than a few months, and almost always worked for cash. This woman, known to the public as Marguerite Oswald, mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, was an imposter. Even though her real name and identity remained unknown, she was the caretaker of Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, whose real name and identity also remain unknown. John Hart Ely was a dedicated 25-year-old staff attorney for the Warren Commission. His assignment was to gather background information on the Oswald family. Ely wrote, quote, "My purpose was to obtain a chronology based on then existing data in our files of the background facts, life, school, places of residence of Mrs. Oswald, her several marriages, her husbands, her 3 children, and in particular, Lee Harvey Oswald." Ely relied on and trusted the documentation given to the Warren Commission by the FBI was genuine. Ely had no reason to mistrust the FBI. But Ely soon realized the FBI was providing little information on Oswald and his family background. After reading a detailed description in Life magazine of Oswald's life in Fort Worth, Ely wrote a memo to his boss and said, quote, "We're getting more information from Life magazine than we are from the FBI. Once again, let me urge that we should not have to rely upon Life magazine for such a list. The FBI should undertake a systematic identification and interview of Oswald's closest school friends." Unfortunately, Ely never realized that the FBI's failure to provide accurate background information on Lee Harvey Oswald and his family was intentional. Mr. Ely was apparently never aware of the ongoing collusion between the FBI and the Warren Commission. The FBI provided the Warren Commission, John Hart Ely, with carefully screened and laundered evidence, photographs, and reports concerning the background of Marguerite and Lee Oswald. However, Mr. Ely on his own interviewed Marines who knew and had personal contact with Lee Oswald. Ely came very close to realizing there were 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds after interviewing Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald at El Toro, while the short, thin, Russian-speaking Harvey was stationed at Santa Ana. Ely was very close to obtaining information and records that would have exposed Lee at El Toro, while at the same time Harvey was stationed at Santa Ana. He prepared and wrote a detailed chronology relating to Oswald and his family background that alarmed members of the Warren Commission. On April 10, 1964, Senior Counsel Albert Jenner wrote a memo to General Counsel J. Lee Rankin, which read, in part, quote, "Our depositions and examination of records and other data disclose that there are details in Mr. Ely's memoranda which will require material alteration and, in some instances, omission. The advice of the Warren Commission's General Counsel is clear. Alter or omit certain background information on Oswald, his mother, and his family." The FBI had reports that showed there were 2 Marguerite Oswalds living close to each other at the same time in Fort Worth for over a year. The FBI's investigation of Marguerite Clavery Oswald ended. They never interviewed employers or coworkers who knew and worked with Marguerite Clavery Oswald in Fort Worth at Clyde Campbell Men's Store, the City of Fort Worth, Paul's Shoe Store, Family Publications, or Cox's Department Store, or Avon Products. Nor did they obtain employment records or interviews of coworkers in New Orleans who knew and worked with Marguerite Clavery Oswald at Burt's Shoe Store, Krieger's, Goldring's Department Store in 1955 and 1956. Nor did the FBI obtain employment records or interview employers or coworkers who knew and worked with Marguerite Clavery Oswald at Goldring's or Krieger's in 1959, 60, 61, 62, 63. The FBI could easily have identified and confirmed Marguerite's employment history through state and federal withholding reports, Social Security contributions, federal and state tax returns. They did nothing. The FBI intentionally avoided any company, any employer, any coworker who may have known or worked with Marguerite Clavery Oswald after the mid-1950s, 1955. The FBI's intentional failure to investigate and make public the employment of Marguerite Clavery Oswald is a clear indication that high-level FBI officials had knowledge of the two Marguerite Oswalds. This may explain why not a single one of our federal income tax returns have ever been released and are marked referred, postponed in full, and remain unavailable to researchers. As a side note, from 1955 through the beginning of 1960, a period of 5 years, the only documented employment of the Marguerite Oswald imposter was a few months at Dolly's Shoe in New Orleans in 1955 and a few months at King Candy in 1958. Otherwise, she was unemployed. Today, what remains are an overwhelming number of FBI reports relating to the Marguerite Oswald imposter. Beginning in 1955, as the number of FBI reports relating to Marguerite Clavery Oswald diminished, the number of FBI reports relating to Marguerite Oswald imposter increased. By the spring of 1955, the Marguerite Oswald imposter became the one and only Marguerite Oswald, mother of the young man who would soon defect to the Soviet Union. From the early 1950s through 1963, the majority of the Marguerite Oswald imposter's employment consisted of working as a bar, as a practical nurse, or as a caretaker where she was paid in cash. Working for cash and avoiding the use of the Social Security number eliminated the possibility that government records and credit bureaus would record the employment of two Marguerite Oswalds at different locations at the same time. The Marguerite Oswald imposter told the Warren Commission that she had worked for some of the wealthiest and most influential families in Fort Worth. In fact, the Marguerite Oswald imposter was employed by the Carter family, owners of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper, in the months leading up to the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, how this elderly, financially destitute woman with no verifiable employment history was able to gain employment as a practical nurse with such a wealthy and influential family is unknown. And why her employment was terminated shortly before President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas remains a mystery. When interviewed by the Warren Commission, the Marguerite Oswald imposter was handed written notes relating to the background of Marguerite Clavery Oswald. Yet she made and continued to make mistakes in her testimony relating to the historical background of Marguerite Clavery Oswald. Warren Commission co-counsel Burt Griffin described the FBI's involvement and collaboration in the investigation of President Kennedy's murder. Griffin said, quote, "All of the records were in the hands of the two agencies, FBI, CIA, and if they so desired, any information or files could have been destroyed or laundered prior to the time the Commission could get them." Griffin was correct. These agencies had destroyed and laundered evidence in order to frame Harvey Oswald, conceal the existence of two Lee Harvey Oswalds, and conceal the existence of the two Marguerite Oswalds. Evidence that, if made public, would have exposed the government agency responsible for their creation, the CIA. Interestingly, on November 9, 1977, Days before he was to testify before the House Select Committee, William C. Sullivan was walking through the woods near Sugar Hill, New Hampshire, on the way to meeting companions. Another hunter, Robert Daniels, a 22-year-old son of a state policeman, using a telescopic sight on a .30 caliber rifle, said he mistook Sullivan for a deer, shot him in the neck, and killed him instantly. The authorities called it an accident, fining Daniels $500 and taking away his hunting license for 10 years. Warren Commission member Richard Russell said, "They, the FBI, have tried the case and reached a verdict on every count." Russell then wrote a letter of resignation from the Warren Commission to Lyndon Johnson, but Johnson refused to accept his resignation. Warren Commission member Hale Boggs said, quote, "We've not been told the truth about Oswald. Boggs and Alaska Nick Begich vanished when their small plane disappeared in Alaska wilderness during a routine flight from Anchorage to Juneau. For what it's worth, I was in Alaska at that time. I remember waking up in the morning and asking one of my fellow coworkers what he thought, and he very simply said, they'll never find them, and they didn't. If the FBI had simply done their job and conducted an honest investigation, we wouldn't be here today." It's the same thing as when I looked at the money order, the postal money order in the Warren volumes. I've been in business, construction, oil business all my life. And I learned a long time ago, when other people are signing checks, I had an office and I had people signing checks. You have a responsibility to yourself to physically look at every single check, make sure every single check is valid, payment where it's supposed to be made, and so on. So my accountant told me to have the check sent to not my office, but to my personal residence and inspect every one of them. And so anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I was very familiar with checks. And when I saw this money order that doesn't have a single bank stamp on it, it took me about 2 seconds to wait a minute. This thing was never run through a bank. I mean, it's right there in front of you. This money order was not cashed or deposited at a bank. There's not a single bank stamp on it. And that one little thing like that can change everything. After leaving office, the man who created the Warren Commission, President Lyndon Johnson, expressed doubts about the Warren Commission's conclusion for the remainder of his life. On one occasion, he told his aide, Marvin Watson, that he was convinced there was a plot in connection with the assassination and, quote, felt the CIA had something to do with the plot. Lyndon Johnson was correct, but it has taken JFK researchers nearly a half century to arrive at the same conclusion. It's going to take people lots and lots of time and effort to uncover all of these things. And the one thing that we must never forget is what we have learned, we're not supposed to know. We're not supposed to know any of this. That it's taken people like you and me and others to work through these things and the time and the effort to try and find the real answers. Margaret Oswald is interviewed by the House Select Committee. She's asked about her relationship with Raoul Sear. This was an attorney that she worked for in her early 20s. And she refused to discuss it. And then they asked her other questions about her subsequent employment. She refused to discuss it. Why? Why would you refuse to discuss your employment history when you were in your mid-20s? Most people would have no reason not to discuss it. But she's just saying, I'm not going to talk about it. I don't want to discuss it. For the simple reason, she didn't know the first thing about Marguerite Claverie Oswald's employment in her early 20s. So you start to have these doubts about Marguerite Oswald. And then I talked to a fellow who worked with Marguerite Oswald at the Paul Shoe store. On the telephone, I called him up. And he just happened to mention offhanded that he had a photograph of Paul's shoe store employees in 1957. And I just about fell over backwards. And I got in my car, and I immediately drove to Fort Worth and met him, and he showed me the photograph, and I'd never, ever seen a woman, Marguerite Oswald, look like that. And that convinced me right then and there, there's a fake one and a real one. Then you read the testimony of Myrtle and Julian Evans, who knew Marguerite Oswald since the 1930s. And they say, we never would have recognized her. She's changed so much. She used to be a beautiful woman. And Robert's hosting a Thanksgiving dinner. The Marguerite Oswald imposter is not invited. Why? Well, John Pick's invited. Do you think Pick just might look at that woman and realize it's not his mother? That's why she wasn't invited. But Harvey was invited. Now remember, it's been 10 years since John Pick has seen Lee Harvey Oswald, his brother, in New York City. One of the first things Pick says is, he identified me as his half-brother. We've never in our lives said half-brother. I'm his brother, not half-brother. And he looked a lot different. Oswald was working at Two Jacks. Fine. What does that have to do with Oswald's employment in 1955 and 1956? It has to do with fake W-2 forms. The FBI created a W-2 form for Dolly Hsu. They created a W-2 form for Pfister Dental Laboratory. They created a W-2 form for J.R. Michaels. They created 1955 and 1956, two W-2 forms for Two Jacks. Now, when I first discovered this, one of the things I noticed was that the typing looked exactly the same on several of these W-2 forms. So I made transparencies. I went down to Kinko's or somewhere and got clear transparencies, and I overlaid two clear transparencies, one over the other. And what I found was you have to have the typing exactly the same. I mean, someone said Lee Oswald, someone said L.H. Oswald. But the 126 exchange and the Social Security numbers were exactly the same. When you overlay those, they're perfect. I thought they were typed with the same typewriter. So we sent those W-2 forms to IBM. And the archivist, she wrote back and she said, yes, typing was done with the same typewriter. So now you've got someone, in my mind it's the FBI, who else, who created W-2 forms to show Oswald's employment in 1955 and 1956, and they included them with evidence that they sent back to the Dallas police. That's how the W-2 forms got in the Warren Commission records. So the FBI did a very quick and absolutely undocumented report as to Oswald's employment in 1955 and 1956. Now, let's stop there just for a minute, and let's think about this just for a second. Oswald's 15 years old in 1955. What difference does it make? What he was doing, where he was working when he's 15 years old, 16 years, what difference does it make? Why in the world is the FBI making a big deal out of this? They made a big deal out of this because Harvey was working at a few of those jobs, while Lee was working the entire year and a half at Two Jacks. And you cannot explain what in the world two Oswalds, two Lee Harvey Oswalds were doing, working at two different companies at the same time. And that threatened to expose the Oswald Project. How likely is it that you keep these W-2 forms with you when you move from New Orleans to Dallas and you join the Marines? Maybe you take them with you, maybe you don't. Then you come back home, you defect to the Soviet Union. You come back, you move to New Orleans, you move back to Dallas, and then after the assassination, these pristine, unfolded W-2 forms are found among your possessions? I mean, how likely is that? So, Two Jack was not just an employer. Two Jack was real close to the people in the intelligence community in New Orleans. Two Jack was one of the founding members of the Friends of Democratic Cuba. He was, he was vice president and a first officer, along with Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister and Two Jack. So Two Jack had a pretty close relationship with these people. And of course, Guy Bannister was the former head of the Chicago office and good friends with Hoover. And along with Bannister and those people, their office was in Clay Shaw's trademark building. And then you've got Gordon Novell talking about how he attended meetings in Bannister's office, along with David Atlee Phillips and Ehud Hunt. So you've got all these CIA-connected people, and here's Tujap right with them. Did they know about each other? Yeah. Harvey and Lee knew about each other. Pieces of information that are out there, overlooked or just fall by the wayside, very significant pieces of research have been overlooked. People for years and years and years have been arguing back and forth about Oswald. Did he have enough time to walk from his rooming house to the Tippit murder scene? Well, I found a report and writings by a former researcher, and this fellow did a lot of work relating to the Dallas police dictabelts and tape recordings of the dispatcher. And it's very involved and very long, but what he showed through scientific analysis, independent scientific analysis, was that there's a very, very good possibility that both the dictabelt and the tape recordings were altered, fabricated. You know, you look at these things, and then you look at the scientific evidence that shows the speed in certain areas of the vinyl disc that was used by the Dallas police. Some of it was, for lack of better words, sped up, and some of it was slower, which indicated that it was not the original recording. Then the whole basis of the Tippit shooting has nothing to do with how long it took Oswald to walk, allegedly to walk from his rooming house to the scene of the Tippit murder scene. It has to do with what was, researched 20 years ago or 25 years ago, and that's the dictabelts. And if those truly are fabrications, which I believe them to be, then nothing about the Tippit murder that the Warren Commission gave to us makes any sense. And along the same lines, I find it interesting, and I think other researchers should find it just incredibly interesting, why in all of the interrogations of Oswald, all these, federal officers, Dallas police, Fritz, even Postal Inspector Harry Holmes sitting in on these interrogations, why do we not have one single question about the Tippit murder? Remember, Oswald was arrested for murdering the policeman, not for murdering President Kennedy. So why in the world do we not have anybody asking him, how did you get there? What was your route? Nobody asked him that. Nobody asked him how many times he shot Tippit, which you walked, how did he get to the theater? Did he buy a ticket to get in the Texas theater? What was his route to the Texas? Nothing. And I think that's just bizarre.